One of the biggest strengths of Fate Grand Order is seeing its large cast of characters interact with each other. So from the moment I first read the description of the manga called a scrapbook, I knew I had to read it. What I expected was a cute slice of life anthology. Instead, I have dry tear ducts. This single volume of short stories caught me completely off guard, and now that my heart has healed from the stories inside, I am happy to tell you why you need to read this manga. Published in 2018, Fate Grand Order called a Scrapbook is an 8-chapter manga that takes time to delve into the lives of the characters in Fate Go. Each chapter features a different cast and gives a peek into their lives, mentalities, and everyone's favorite, traumas. Despite the short length of the stories, they all manage to strike at the heart at least a little bit. And when I say short, I mean that half of these chapters are less than 12 pages. Don't think that means you'll be safe though, as each of those pages are full of characterization and little interactions that can somehow feel somber and cozy at the same time. It's a weird vibe, but it works for this little project. It spends its short runtime peering into the minds of the characters to show all the good and bad rolling through their heads. There is no plot to most of these stories. It might be more accurate to call it a collection of character interactions than anything else. But that deep character focus is what makes this manga so special. Without focusing on character drama or big bad threats, it can give us an incredibly intimate look at the characters, revealing who they are to their core. That intimacy is at the heart of this manga and the very thing that gives it life. The charm and tragedy stem from it and blend into the strange mixture that creates a fantastic experience and vibe that remains from chapter to chapter. To perfectly set the tone, the first chapter covers the familial relationship between Mash and Romani from Romani's point of view. Along with the heartfelt warmth of seeing the growing bonds between these two, we see Romani's fears and doubts eating away at him as he exposes Mash to life. He knows that exposing Mash to more of the world would make the reality of her short lifespan all the more painful. But he remains determined to show her the beauty of life since he believes it's what's best for her. We see Romani's care and attentiveness for her, getting her prescription glasses as soon as he notices her bad vision. We see his fighting to get Mash a better position within Chaldea. We see him introduce her to all the amazing things the world has to offer, and his promise that one day she will see the world herself. And in the end, we see his big moment, his great sacrifice of his normal life, and the loss felt by the master of Chaldea. On the last page, we see Mash remembering Romani asking her why she still wore her glasses even though her vision had gotten better, and how she wasn't able to admit that it's because they were a gift from him. There's no real plot or any stakes, just snippets of the life of these two characters, an intimate look into their relationship and life, and that is to the manga's strength. Fate Go has plenty of story chapters, events, and My Room lines to flesh out its large roster of characters, but at the end of the day, it's still a game, a product meant to be played, and that comes with some baggage that it can't easily get rid of. By its nature as a game, it has to have game. While there is the rare interlude that is essentially just a visual novel, by and large the pacing of the stories are influenced by its need for combat, which, while not preventing in-depth character writing, it does take us away from the intimacy that we find here in this manga. Not to mention, this form of media isn't limited by the constraints of the visual novel format that the game uses, which is great because while I don't think Nakatani's character art is always the best, their paneling and composition is absolutely fantastic. In the first chapter alone, Romani gets some really good shots. I especially like this one that shows him being followed by these dark tendrils that come from outside of the panel, a perfect representation of the burden he's had to carry since being granted this normal life. The overall style of the manga is superb, and every chapter, at minimum, is a visual treat, including the much shorter Chapter 2. Once again, our concept is simple. Arturia Lily has gotten her other selves together for a tea party, where peace is maintained by the one thing all versions of Saber are compelled by: food. In this case, provided by Emiya, who is actually referred to as being a mom here, and God, I love this manga for that. After a fun little squabble between the various selves, we get to the deeply personal and simple emotional hook of this chapter. Lily simply asks our older selves if they remember Eto, their horse from before they started down the path of a king. And to her relief, both Saber and Saber Alta recall and speak kindly of their old friend. And while the young king trains with X, her older selves comment on her innocence, with Alter saying she can't bear to see a version of herself who doesn't know of all the horrors they will witness, while Arturia adds that she is also unaware of the smiles of the people. She knows how terrifying her ignorance must make things for Lily, and that she keeps on her path despite it. She ruminates with herself a little more before we get some small jokes from the other Saber faces and the chapter ends. Fortunately, this one left my heart intact. Definitely a mercy after that first chapter, but it still keeps with the intimate feel. Seeing Arturia casually chatting with her alter makes things interesting, but to see them talking about their past self and something as simple and personal as their old horse is compelling in the most basic of ways. Having it rooted in something so human grounds these larger-than-life figures. And while the length of the chapter is short, every line of dialogue carries weight with it. Every single piece of dialogue has meaning. It's simply good and engaging storytelling. Even the third chapter, easily the weakest of the volume, isn't without worth. It just happens to be about Mash and Master, a relationship that already gets well covered in the game. It's also the only chapter with action scenes, which aren't bad, and Altera fans are definitely eating well from it. I just find that the chapter doesn't say much of interest. Mash is struggling to keep herself determined in combat, but the Master's voice keeps her grounded. It's nice, simple, intimate like the other chapters. I just find it a little less compelling due to how often we see moments like it between Mash and the Master. Luckily, the fourth chapter takes us back to the good stuff, focusing on Jeanne Arc as she reflects on her life and the differences between herselves. Jalter mocks her normal self while she's caring for Santa Lily, sarcastically saying that she is more the saint every day, to which Jeanne simply replies that she isn't a saint. The altar tells her that her thoughts don't matter. Everyone considers her a saint, so she is. Jalter claims that her role in everything was to be used and betrayed, but is met with Jeanne saying she knew that it would turn out like that from the start. Unable to deal with her optimistic view of events, Jalter walks off, saying that her normal version doesn't even consider all that she gave up for her mission. This is where it gets interesting as we see deeper into Jeanne's mentality. She knows full well the kind of life she may have given up, and is content knowing that she even had the option of living like a normal girl at all. She remembers her allies and friends and the joy of victory she felt with them, and the horrible destruction she helped bring to her enemies. It's clear she holds herself responsible for a lot of bloodshed, but she believes in the path she chose, so she presses on, believing that one day she will have to pay for her decisions. She tells her younger self that she doesn't have regrets though, and that she isn't some miserable character. She acts with dignity and conviction, so even though her story doesn't have the happiest ending, she's content with having lived the way she chose to. She says that her other selves in Chaldea are fine as they are as well. She acknowledges that they have their own wishes, and even implies that she thinks Jalter is more human than her, living free and honestly. But even with acknowledging that, she still doesn't lament who she is. Just the simple fact that she had the chance to live normally was enough to make her happy. She says that it's hard to live a pure life and that living free must be fun. Which is when Jalter reappears and tells her that's why she hates her, and she begins to bicker with the original while Santa Lily remarks that she has trouble being honest with herself. But that isn't quite where the chapter ends, as the last few pages are both of Gilles de Rais, where the Saber version threatens to kill the caster if he harms Jeanne or the Master in any way. The caster smiles at his younger self and says how he should show the face he's making to Jeanne, because it is a face that utterly detests God. In these 3 pages, the manga shows how a man can be corrupted by his conviction better than other stories do with entire chapters dedicated characters. It's utterly insane how well this manga does short stories, and the Jeanne stuff is just as good. These few pages get me more invested in her than any other Fate property has. I have to mention again just how good the paneling in this manga can be as well. It really elevates it to the next level. Especially these panels where Jalter points at Santa Lily. The paneling is masterful and stays consistent the whole way through. Chapter 5 is all about Okita and her guilt at being unable to die fighting for the Shinsengumi. This one is interesting because unlike the vague time frames the other chapters could happen in, this one is explicitly set during the second Guda Guda event, which isn't important, but I think it's cool. And it lets us see the Master in some different clothes. Although, even if he is looking slick, he's still fairly irrelevant. The main feature here is Okita's recollection of her life and her regret at dying peacefully without her comrades. Fun thing is that a lot of what is shown here in the manga is reminiscent of what Okita's interlude in Fate Go is like. They aren't one-to-one, but someone was definitely reusing homework for that interlude. The highlights of this chapter I think come from Cha-Cha's anger at Okita's lament and Hijikata's treatment of her. Unlike the Sakura Saber, Cha-Cha wasn't able to die peacefully, so to see someone wish to die in conflict is aggravating for her. She walks off taking the Master with her because she can't stand to be around her like this. And after envisioning being left behind by her friends, Okita sees Hijikata's coat and fools around with it for a bit before the man returns to the base to see her goofing around. The first thing he does is throw Okita her uniform, telling her to put it on. And to Okita, this means the world to her. Because if Hijikata, the man who represents the Shinsengumi more than anyone else, still acknowledges her as a member, then maybe it's okay for her to still consider herself Shinsengumi. And this incredibly sweet ending is immediately followed by cheating, because chapter 6 isn't about Fate Go at all. Instead, we head all the way back to the early 2000s, where 2 mages are on a date with their pet lion. Yep, chapter 6 gives us a taste of stay night for a few pages, showing Shiro and Ren's date from Ren's perspective. She considers both the differences between her and Shiro, as well as the normal things that she's given up in order to be a mage. And just as she begins to have doubts about her life, Shiro and Saber reassure her, simply by saying that they like who she is now. which brings us to a very cute ending where she enjoys her time with them. It's incredibly sweet and easily summarized. But the characters are already really fleshed out in Stay Night, so this scene doesn't really add all that much. Still worth reading, but it is the total opposite of the 7th chapter. Here our focus is on the Master of Chaldea, and it's always interesting to see how they depict them, seeing as their personality is barely defined in the game, leaving creators to get really interesting with them. And they don't disappoint here, as the Master is frequently dreaming about the lives of their servants, and while the text acknowledges the good of their lives, the images shown are hardly joyful. Memories of death, solitude, and mental collapse flood the Master's mind. With her sleep being as troubled as it is, one night she goes to get a drink of water in the kitchen, where she finds Emiya and Waver. She tries to play off her issues, but the image of Emiya's death ruins her poker face, and she ends up opening up to the two of them. Fortunately, having been masters themselves, they are the perfect duo to give her advice. While Waver acknowledges the differences between the Master's impressions and reality of the servants' lives, Emiya explains that the way the Master always tries to connect with her servants is one of the reasons they've been as successful as they have. Waver chimes in to say if she wants to know more about heroic spirits, she should just ask them herself, and the Master immediately puts this into action by asking Emiya and Waver why they help her. And they both say they can't stand by when the Master is so green. The Master has a good laugh, and the three go their separate ways. Until the next day when Emiya chews them out for not washing their cups, once again cementing his place as Chaldea's #1 mother. And more than any other chapter, this one feels like the thesis statement of the manga. It provides us with a closer look into the psyches of some of our favorite characters to give us deeper insights into what make them so compelling. So a chapter that advises the Master, our player character, to do that exact thing is a symbol for that idea. It's a good reminder of everything this manga is before we hit the final chapter. Chapter 8 is all about Irisviel sorting out her feelings about Emiya Assassin, both the ways that it reminds her and is different from Kiritsugu. Emiya Archer tries to persuade her not to pursue Assassin, saying that she'll be the one who gets hurt. When she asks him if he knows the other Guardian, he says he doesn't. Can't imagine that being counter-Guardians keeps family bonds strong. With his decidedly unhelpful advice in tow, she ends up running into Emiya Alter and Jaguar Warrior. The man doesn't recognize her, and Jaguar Warrior says he's had trouble remembering things lately. Irisviel is distraught to see the lengths counter-Guardians will go to, pushing themselves past their breaking point to fulfill their duty. In his dazed state, he mistakes her for Ilia and asks why she's crying, which somehow gives her visions of his life. Fortunately, Jaguar Warrior jumps in and snaps her out of it before it gets too overwhelming. She says to leave the man to her, and she leads Emiya Alter away. After the heartbreaking experience of witnessing a counter-Guardian's life, she's comforted by Ilia, who, even knowing that this Irisviel isn't her mother, doesn't want to see her crying. She reveals that she recognizes who both Emiyas are, and that seeing them feels sad. As Irisviel begins to feel like her life is a lie, Ilia tells her about her mother, who is always smiling and kind. Irisviel hugs Ilia and runs off to find Emiya Assassin, now realizing that there's a world out there where she was able to live happily with her family. Once she finds him in the snows outside of Chaldea, she admits that she is selfishly trying to connect with and save the man who insists he isn't Kiritsugu. She takes his hand and convinces him to guide her back to the base, and even the torn-up assassin understands the feelings that Irisviel's warmth conveys. Simple messages of love from a woman who simply doesn't want her husband to suffer alone. The assassin monologues to himself, saying that he planned to just brush her aside, to completely ignore her, but he couldn't take his eyes off her. He reassures himself that no matter what Kiritsugu thought of her, no matter how he judged her, he would make the same decision every time, unaware of the fact that there existed a world where he didn't. It's a heartfelt and tragic tale, and one of the best in the book. It perfectly captures the odd joys and tragedies allowed by Grand Order's unique setting. Seeing characters reunited but in slightly different forms that experience friction over their differences. It's interesting. And of course, Irisviel's experiencing the tragedies of the other counter-Guardians is heartrending. Seeing such a kind woman break down when faced with such dismal fates is as depressing as seeing her push past them is inspiring. And while this is the final chapter, we have 3 more pages to close out the manga. Short and simple, they show Mash walking out into the snowy night, staring up at the starry sky and remembering how Romani told her she would see this view one day. At least that's what I assume is happening. I can't see through all the water in my eyes. There is no better way that this collection of intimate stories could end than by wrapping it up with a succinct conclusion to how he began. And that is all for Chaldea Scrapbook. It's a touching collection of stories that I recommend to any fans of Fate Grand Order. Servants are a large part of what makes this series so compelling, and seeing these unique takes on the characters is well worth it. And before I go, I have to say thanks to everyone who got us to 1,000 subscribers. It is seriously wild to think that I got this far, and if you have any ideas on how we can celebrate this little accomplishment, leave them down in the comments. Thanks for listening to my insane ramblings. See you next time.